From the Diary of Bill Lowy, Wednesday, November 4th. It is very close to election time in the U.S., and things are very quiet here. There was a big troop lift about 80 miles south of here in the area of Ca Mau. Some 89 known VC dead and untold wounded. Also, 3 60mm mortars were captured. One ARVN was killed. In this entry, Popi describes the wartime rhythms that somehow mirrored the political timelines back home. With the U.S. election nearing, he notes an unexpected lull in activity, a temporary calm during what was otherwise a turbulent period in Vietnam. Yet, this quiet was contrasted by a significant troop lift, Operation South near Ca Mau. In that operation, ARVN forces, with U.S. support, engaged in intense combat with the Viet Cong, resulting in 89 confirmed enemy deaths, numerous wounded, and the capture of 3 60mm mortars. As we saw with last episode, these types of mortars were crucial Viet Cong weapons, often used in their swift hit-and-run style of warfare. Yet, even with the high enemy casualties, ARVN experienced just one fatality, a testament to the tactical differences and complexities of these ground confrontations. This particular region, Ca Mau, located in the southernmost part of Vietnam, was a challenging area with dense mangrove forests, swamps, and extensive waterways. It was an ideal hiding place for the Viet Cong, who used the terrain to their advantage. Popi's mention of this successful but bloody engagement highlights the ongoing, complex struggle for control over strategic areas, even as the home front remained focused on its own shifting political landscape. The 1964 U.S. presidential election was one of the most ideologically charged in American history, with incumbent Democrat Lyndon B. Johnson facing off against Republican Barry Goldwater. Each candidate stood on the opposite ends of the political spectrum, and the key issues of the election would shape the nation's future. Of the many issues at hand, the civil rights movement may have been at the forefront. In 1964, racial tensions ran high as the fight for equality gained momentum across the country. Johnson had just signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a landmark piece of legislation that banned racial segregation in schools, workplaces, and public facilities. A year earlier, in 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had just given his famous I Have a Dream speech, and by December of 1964, he will be awarded his Nobel Peace Prize. Also, it is worthy of note that Malcolm X was still alive in this period, later getting assassinated in February of 1965. Needless to say, the civil rights movement was a central issue in this election. Johnson's firm support for civil rights was risky. It was driving a wedge between him and the Democratic South. Goldwater, meanwhile, opposed the act, not on racial grounds, he claimed, but as a matter of states' rights. This stance resonated with Southern conservatives, but many critics saw it as racially insensitive. National security was also a pressing issue. The Cold War loomed large and Americans were on edge. Johnson favored a policy of containment, aiming to stop the spread of communism without triggering direct conflict. Goldwater, on the other hand, took a hardline stance. He openly discussed the possibility of using nuclear weapons if necessary. This led to Johnson's famous Daisy ad, which warned Americans of the dangers of nuclear war. The ad begins with a little girl in a field pulling the petals off a daisy and counting up every time she pulled one. When she is done, a voice from off-screen begins to count down. When the voice reaches 0, footage of nuclear explosions are shown. Another voice states, "These are the stakes: to make a world in which all of God's children could live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other, or we must die. Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home." The ad clearly implied that Goldwater's approach to the Cold War was recklessly hawkish, even going so far as to suggest that his policies could lead to a nuclear conflict and ultimately, the end of the world. Although not yet the substantial issue it would later become, the Vietnam War was slowly creeping into the minds of the Americans. Johnson advocated for a measured escalation in Vietnam, while Goldwater argued for a more aggressive approach. However, in 1964, few could have imagined how deeply this conflict would later define Johnson's presidency and divide the American public. On the home front, Johnson introduced his ambitious Great Society program. His vision aimed to tackle poverty, racial injustice, and improve access to education and healthcare. It was a bold vision for America and marked a clear expansion of government's role in people's lives. Goldwater, however, argued against increased government intervention. He warned that Johnson's plans would lead to a bloated federal government and higher taxes. He believed in a free market approach, advocating for personal responsibility and less federal control. Finally, the issue of law and order made its way into the conversation. With rising crime rates and unrest in American cities, Goldwater advocated for a strong stance on law and order, framing Johnson's policies as too permissive. Johnson countered by emphasizing the need to address poverty and inequality to combat crime at its roots. The 1964 election remains a pivotal moment where America faced questions that still resonate today. questions of civil rights, the role of government, national security, and the nature of American power in the world. When this episode is published, it will be only one day before the 2024 U.S. presidential election, one which reflects the increasing political rhetoric of contemporary American politics, which frame it as the most important election of our lifetime. President Biden has even gone so far as to say that recent elections are a battle for the soul of the nation. Given the context of the election 60 years ago, I ask, what has changed? Are the issues so different? What were the things that were a priority for Popi? Was he worried about the Vietnam War expanding? Or was he grappling with greater, even more pressing existential threats of nuclear war? One candidate had no problem implying that the election of the other could lead to the end of the world. How does that relate to what is being said today? After all, if Kamala gets elected, the country is certain to fall into communism. But if Trump gets a second term, the country will lead the world into a liberal fascism. Are these consequences not, at the very least, the end of the world as we know it? I'd like to take this time to ask you, the listener, to consider the parallels between these two moments in time. What do they say for what is going on today? Do we not still have a new but increasingly hostile conflict with Russia? Are things more or less stable than they were no more than 20 years after the defeat of the Nazis in World War II? How did these people feel about technology, and how does it relate to how we feel today about the dangers of AI in the information age? If you would indulge me for a moment, these questions remind me of a quote from the Bible. I'm not one to share verses, but for some reason today this one feels suitable. Perhaps we can find wisdom through these words. Ecclesiastes 1:3-11. What do people gain from all their labors at which they toil under the sun? Generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun sets and hurries back to where it rises. The wind blows to the south and turns to the north. Round and round it goes, ever returning on its course. All streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place the streams come from, there they return again. All things are wearisome, more than one can say. The eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear its fill of hearing. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which one can say, "Look, this is something new. It was here already, long ago. It was here before our time." No one remembers the former generations, and even those yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow them. The photo I chose for today depicts Popi standing in front of a sign with different names of towns painted on individual arrows. Beside each town name is a number marking the distance from that town. This sign was a point of reference for Popi, informing how far from home he was and in what direction. Maybe it was a reminder of what he was fighting for. Perhaps it was just a fun sign. He looks a lot like one of my cousins in this picture. I'm Alex Lowy, and I hope you have enjoyed listening to this episode of Dearest Suzie, and receiving messages from the past that my Popi wrote exactly 60 years ago. I sincerely appreciate your time and interest. Please consider following the podcast on your preferred platform, and if you're enjoying it, I kindly ask that you take the time to rate the show and leave a review. Also, please follow the project on YouTube, X, and Instagram. All likes, comments, shares, and reviews will help grow the reach of this story. The links for these things should be in the description of this episode. Please feel free to email me at dearestsuziepodcast@gmail.com if you have anything you'd like to say. I'd love to chat or to hear about your stories as well. Thank you for listening, and God bless.